So when the industry has talked about convergence in the past, they've talked about it in terms of some magical black box that all the media flows through. And I kept reading articles that said we're nowhere near convergence, that there's no box that's going to contain our media. And it struck me more and more that that was the point, that media flowed everywhere, and that the convergence was within our heads, that as we engage with media, we bring the pieces together. But we live in a world where every story, every idea spreads across the maximum number of media channels, and that it's shaped both by decisions made in corporate boardrooms and by decisions made in teenagers' bedrooms. That it's both top-down, corporate-driven, and bottom-up, grassroots-driven. And so that's the essence of the argument of convergence culture. Now, deeper question is participatory culture, right? I first used the term participatory culture in the title of Textual Poachers, a book I wrote almost 23 years ago, describing the cultures of fans. And I had grown up as a fan. I was very much part of the world of fan culture and kept bumping up against the way media scholars were thinking about spectators in the world of mass media. And so I wanted some way to contrast the sort of passive assumptions that we have of people just sitting in front of the TV show set and watching whatever flowed across the channels with a very active sense of a community that creates its own culture, that is engaged publicly in conversations about the culture and stories that matter to them. And so that was the roots of spectator culture. Over time, as it's taken depth, I see participatory culture as in some ways the application of a folk culture model to the contents of mass culture. So we can think of it as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So folk culture, mass culture, digital participatory culture is the way forward when we bring those things together. And this has struck me as something rather interesting as I've been traveling through Latin America, is the relationship of folk culture to mass media is very different in the Southern Hemisphere than in my own country. That Hollywood largely obliterated the participatory sides of folk culture, that most of us became spectators of our own culture. Whereas in this part of the world, very vibrant folk traditions survived into the 20th century. And I think that may give Latin America the chance to reimagine the digital in a very powerful way. That is, if you can mobilize the samba schools and the carnivals and the other sort of folk traditions as you go forward into the 21st century, those may give you a guidance of how to work in a culture of which is open, which is sharing, which is participatory, which is democratic at its core. Yeah, many media theorists are interested in what media is doing to us, and I've always been interested in what we are doing with media. So the cultural practices around media are really deep and profound and shape the direction of the technology. So when we hear people talk about Web 1.0, Web 2.0, it's as if they imagine everything important about the web began with the invention of technology, and that this is the history of about 20 years. But in fact, we see around the world that the history of participatory culture goes back hundreds of years. This is the way humans have created. We've borrowed stories and retold them and remixed them. We've lived in communities of people who we shared our passions and interests with, including communities that communicate over space. The Cavalier poets writing love songs for people they might never see face to face. The toy printing press movement of the 19th century of teenagers publishing things and circulating them on a national and even international basis. Behind the web is a rich history of cultural practices, which if we take the Web 2.0, Web 1.0 logic, this may be Web -10, right? It may be way over here. And so I think we've calibrated our history of technology the wrong way by only focusing on the technical developments and not understanding how they grow out of social and cultural practices. Well, I think we are tactile creatures. We live in our bodies. We engage each other with a kiss and a touch and a hug. That's the way we engage with the physical world. And I would say that the tactile interface is to restore the physicality of the real world to the virtual world. That for a long time, the struggle was to develop a metaphor for organizing digital information that in some way reflected the world we lived in, but was intangible. So the virtual desktop became the central metaphor. The folder on the web. But I think what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years has been just the explosion of touch as the central interface, whether we're talking about the Wii, which involves the whole body, or the iPhone or the iPad, which involve touch. The tactility of the controller of the TiVo, I think, is another great example of an interface that depends on the knowledge we have of our bodies. And I think it's the human reasserting itself over the technological. It's tactile reasserting itself over the virtual. Well, I think we often want to understand where information is coming from, but I'm not sure we want to divide it simply real and virtual, the televisual, the telephonic. There are many different sources of information we'd want to talk about. In some sense, the virtual is where I inhabit when I'm talking to my son on the telephone over great distances. It's where our heads are and where we meet is where the virtual is. But I think that increasingly we move between the virtual and the real so fluidly, so often in the course of the day. It's as if we carry a cloud of information around with us wherever we go. We carry our social networks as we move from place to place, like a turtle carries the shell on its back. And so does the turtle think of himself as flesh and shell, or simply one entity? We may be like the turtle now, both physical and virtual. It's all part of us. It's all part of the ways we navigate the world. Well, I think if we turn to, I'm much inspired by Pierre Levy, the French-Canadian theorist who talks about collective intelligence. And he describes a world where nobody knows everything. The Renaissance man idea is dead. There's too much information out there. That everyone knows something, that there are many, many kinds of expertise, and our culture benefits from that rich diversity. And that individual members owe something to the community that they're a part of. That our information we possess belongs to the community, and we contributed on demand, much like a volunteer fire department responds to an alarm. So in that world, he's trying to reconcile individuality and collectivity, the individual and the crowd, and we're trying to understand how value gets created. So the wisdom of the crowd model, James Surowiecki's model, is based on aggregation, in which each voice is independent, autonomous, but in fact becomes invisible when you calculate the average between all of our thoughts. Collective intelligence is based on diversity and individuality, but also deliberation. So in a model of collective intelligence, the individual's voice still matters enormously. Their creative contribution, their knowledge is an important part of what allows the community to arrive, but it's in deliberation with other voices. It's a democratic process where voices come together and share and talk to each other about the issues that matter to them. I tend to side with the idea that we're expanding the public sphere, that we now live in an era of networked publics, where we have more capacity to deliberate together and share knowledge and share culture with each other than ever before. And that's my hopes for participatory culture, is it will be deeply democratic if we empower all citizens to be able to contribute and participate in the decision-making of the culture. That is, and the choice is ours to make, because we face this great participation gap where many are left behind, where many don't have access not only to the technology, but the social experiences, the skills and competencies needed to contribute to that public sphere. That it's still a world where there are very powerful forces. Mass media speaks louder than everyone else, but it may be increasingly outnumbered by the voices of more democratic or grassroots media producers. If we balance those things, then we reach a point where there's greater diversity within our culture, where many voices can be heard, and voices that were not heard before can speak and have an impact on the directions the culture takes. And that's a profound political, cultural transformation if we achieve it. Right now, if we don't deal with the participation gap, then we're at the point where the same elites that control the messages of newspapers or magazines or broadcast media still dominate the internet, right? That it's just more different voices, less centralized voices of the elite, but it is still the elite until we find a way to reach down and get that technology and get those skills into the hands of all citizens within the society. Well, what is it? Andy Warhol said that everyone would be famous for 10 minutes, and now Nicholas Negroponte says everyone will be famous with 10 people. I mean, there's definitely that challenge, right? How do we cut through the clutter? How do we get our voices heard? And that's where I think models of collective intelligence really help us to understand this. That the conversations may take place on relatively small scales, but out of that, the community itself reaches consensus, arrives at voices and perspectives that it wants to hear, and it moves up higher and higher in the range of voices. This is the essence of the book I'm writing right now on spreadable media. How do the individual decisions we make to pass along a message or a video to our friends, to send it through our social networks, our Twitter accounts, our Facebook accounts, our blogs and live journals, how does that decision affect the visibility of that culture? So it's not that any individual has anywhere near the control or power of a network executive, but collectively, we have the ability to shape the messages that are most visible within our culture by the decision to click and send it to someone else. And that sense of spreading and circulating media is where I think power will come. That's where the filtering takes place. That's where we make decisions as a community about what matters to us and what has value. And I think over time, corporate media will have to monitor and respond to the flow of that communication across society, or it will be displaced by something else that is more responsive to those decisions. And that means that there will be voices that come bottom up. So in my country, if we look at YouTube, for example, the Asian American community has been among those groups to use live blogging very effectively. There are very few Asian American voices to be seen on American television. There are much more visible Asian American voices to be seen on YouTube. And it's just one example of minority content that begins to get greater visibility in a world where anyone can contribute, and then the community sorts out and spreads that content that they think speaks powerfully to its concerns. Well, I think schools around the world have been deeply schizophrenic organizations. They wire the classroom and then disconnect the students from the internet. And it's that kind of push-pull that's, I think, a fundamental problem. That in my country, the goal had been to make sure every kid in America had access to network computing. And the pressure was to put that through schools and public libraries, because that was the place that would be the great equalizer, that those who couldn't afford computers outside the school could come to school and use the computer. But the minute we did that, then they began to put pressure on, let's put mandatory filters on those computers so you can't access all the information on the web. Let's block blogging technologies and social networks and Twitter, and let's discourage the use of Wikipedia, and let's filter out YouTube. So that in fact, what they get is a sort of caged garden that doesn't really allow them to engage and learn the skills that people who have access to technology outside of schools have access to. So the school is really one of the few places that can get technology in the hands of every citizen, which can teach people how to use that technology effectively, ethically, creatively, responsibly, safely. But in fact, it constantly turns its back on that problem and walks away because it's such a deeply conservative institution. And people have said that by and large, if Aristotle came back and saw a modern school, he would recognize almost everything that's going on there, because the practices of teaching have been that deeply conservative that they've changed very little over thousands of years of human history. So that's the paradox. The school is the center of a struggle where we have to get the technology in, and not just the technology, but the skills that go along with that technology. I often think about my father, who was a construction worker, and he has a toolkit, and if he set the toolkit on the table and says, here's your technology, go out and build a building, I wouldn't have a clue what to do. And it's not just that I wouldn't know how to use a hammer to nail or a saw to cut wood, but I couldn't conceive of what the project needed to look like. I couldn't have in my head the shape and feel of what that building is and what kinds of supports would need to be there. So I don't just necessarily need to know how to use the technology. I also need to think through the technology and understand the culture and understand how to build things. And I have to have that sense of assurance that my father had, that when he began a project, he knew how to complete it. And I don't have that confidence. I'm not the craftsman my father was. When you think about computers in the school, we think the same thing. We sometimes give kids the tools, or maybe we teach them how to hammer in the sense of teaching them to use the keyboard and a few programs, but we're not teaching them how to think, and we're not building that sense of empowerment and self-confidence that's needed for them to go out into this new public sphere and assert their voice and share their creativity and feel fully a part of it. And so schools have enormous obligations to help us with that, and yet they are in some ways the institution that's most conservative. A survey was done at the University of Wisconsin of 10 entering professions in training. And of those 10, lawyers, doctors, the group that have used technology the least are teachers. They are the least likely to play games, the least likely to surf the web, because teachers have defined themselves as the protectors of book culture and have defended book culture against the digital rather than embracing both as new ways of knowing and understanding the world. And so we have to work with the teachers to help them understand that turning on the computer is not turning their back on the book, that the two can work together. As a father, we used to do a deal with my son that every night, one night he would read us, one night we would read him a bedtime story, and the next night he would tell us a story. And we typed the story into the computer, and we print it out, and he drew pictures, and we put them up in little books, and we sent them to the grandparents for holidays. And that led him to think of himself as an author of his own culture, as someone who could be a storyteller. Now that's a way of building on the skills that many kids have of imagination, but pushing it toward thinking of composition, writing, public communication. And as he did it, we had a chance to talk through with him his imagination, what he was drawing from. And the stories he wrote often took characters from many different films and television shows and records he'd consumed, books. He mashed it all together and created something new that was his personal mythology, drawn from the contents of popular culture. So from the crib, he was learning how to appropriate and remix content. And I think that's the way we need to think about each of these skills. It's not that the most advanced versions of them are accessible to a first or second grader, but some variant of them, some of the building blocks of those skills can begin at a very early age. And if the schools think deeply about those skills and rethink their subject matter through it, you can add those skills to the curriculum in a seamless way. Every discipline takes ownership of the skills that it applies in its own professional work. So that simulation is a skill deeply used in contemporary science, but rarely taught in the science classroom. So if science teachers own simulation, if they use techniques around simulation to teach students how to read critically and evaluate simulations and visualizations as they use them in the course of their day, then we would be one step closer to it. It's not that we want to fundamentally transform what schools teach, but we have to fundamentally transform how schools teach in order to integrate those skills and give every student access to the new modes of thought that they're going to need to be fully participating in this emerging culture. Well, I think I would say that the network is larger than just the computers, right? In some parts of the world, the mobile phone has been the effective technology that people have used to join network publics and connect with each other. In some parts of the world, people print out things from the web and share them with each other if they don't have access to the technology. I've even heard of people putting on microfilm segments of the web and making them available to each other. And as that information spreads, and as the voices spread from the streets to the digital network, the network grows. So it's not about a purely digital network that is a matter of having access to lots of technology. It's about a pattern of communication which allows people to connect into the larger flow of information within the society. And so you connect in whatever ways you can to that system. But one of the nature of the new network society is that the geography doesn't matter as much. So those countries that seemed far from the center of cultural and political and economic power may still exert strong influences because their voices can connect with that larger network in a much more visible way. When I was here in South America last, I visited Chile, and in Santiago I met with a national senator who believed very deeply that World of Warcraft was the training ground for the next generation of leaders for Latin America, that because it was a space where you had to pull together communities with diverse skills from many different backgrounds, and that you had to communicate across great geographic distances and still organize toward common goals, he thought that this was the leadership school. They would prepare Latin Americans to participate more deeply in a global conversation. That the skills that you acquired when you were kind of cut off from the center now become central to connecting Latin America to the rest of the world.